Welcome, brave adventurers, to a journey back in time. Today, we're diving deep into the world of Dragon Warrior, the classic NES RPG that introduced many of us to slimes, drakes, and the joy of grinding for hours to gain a single level. But Dragon Warrior is more than just a single game. It's the gateway to the entire Dragon Quest franchise. In this hour-long saga, we'll explore the origins of the series in Japan, the creation of Dragon Warrior itself. Ever wonder why it wasn't called Dragon Quest here? And how this humble 8-bit adventure shaped the RPG genre as we know it? Along the way, expect some witty banter, personal anecdotes, and a hearty dose of nostalgia. Grab your wooden club and some medical herbs. Our quest begins. 1. The rise of a JRPG legend, a brief history of Dragon Quest. Before Dragon Warrior landed on American shores and into our NES consoles, it was known in Japan as Dragon Quest. And Dragon Quest wasn't just a game, it was a phenomenon. To set the stage for our main story, let's first take a quick journey through the Dragon Quest franchise's early history to understand why this series is so legendary. The birth of Dragon Quest. The tale begins in the mid-1980s in Japan. Video game designer Yuji Horii, a storyteller at heart, had a bold vision: combine the deep, complex gameplay of computer RPGs like Wizardry and Ultima with the accessibility of the Nintendo Famicom. That's the Japanese NES. Horii had already made a name for himself with a murder mystery adventure game, the Portopia Serial Murder Case. But now he wanted to create a fantasy RPG that anyone could pick up and play. He imagined a grand adventure with simple controls and an emotional story. Essentially, an introductory RPG for the masses. To accomplish this, he knew he needed two key ingredients: captivating art and memorable music. Enter Akira Toriyama and Koichi Sugiyama, two names that would become just as important to Dragon Quest as Horii himself. Toriyama was, and is, a superstar manga artist, famous for creating Dragon Ball. He brought a whimsical and instantly recognizable style to the game's characters and monsters. Ever wonder why the iconic slime enemy has such a goofy teardrop shape with a big grin? That's Toriyama's handiwork, a charming design that's now as synonymous with Japanese gaming as Mario's mustache. Meanwhile, Sugiyama was a classically trained composer who, believe it or not, got involved with Enix, the game's publisher, by writing a fan letter about one of their games. Talk about a lucky break. Enix noticed his musical talent, and soon Sugiyama was composing the entire Dragon Quest soundtrack. His work gave Dragon Quest a sweeping orchestral feel, including an unforgettable title theme that still sends shivers down gamers' spines. In fact, Dragon Quest was the first video game to have its music performed by a live orchestra in concert halls, starting a tradition in 1987 and inspiring composers like Nobuo Uematsu of Final Fantasy to dream bigger with game music. So with Horii crafting the scenario and gameplay, Toriyama drawing colorful characters, and Sugiyama conducting an 8-bit symphony, the stage was set. In May 1986, Dragon Quest, or Dorgan Quisudo in Japanese, was released for the Famicom. It didn't have cutting-edge graphics or fast-paced action. Instead, it offered something new to console players, a chance to be the hero in an epic fantasy. Japanese gamers fell in love. Dragon Quest introduced players to the kingdom of Alefgard, a land terrorized by the evil Dragon Lord, and cast them as a lone hero destined to save the day. It was a simple story by today's standards: rescue the princess, gather mystical artifacts, defeat the big bad. But in 1986, this kind of narrative-driven adventure on a home console was revolutionary, and it paid off. The game sold like hotcakes, turning Dragon Quest into a household name in Japan. The Dragon Quest boom. To truly grasp the impact, consider this. By the time Dragon Quest III released in 1988 in Japan, the series had become so popular that it's often claimed the government had to intervene in its release schedule. There's an urban legend, famous among gamers, that Dragon Quest III caused such a frenzy, with hundreds of school children ditching classes to line up for the game, that the Japanese government supposedly passed a law forbidding game releases on school days. The reality is a bit less dramatic. While no actual law was passed, it is true that over 300 students were caught skipping school to buy DQ3, and the social disruption was so noted that Enix, the publisher, voluntarily started releasing future Dragon Quest games on weekends. Imagine a video game causing a nationwide bout of truancy. That's the level of cultural impact we're talking about. For context, Dragon Quest became the all-time best-selling game series in Japan over the subsequent decades, a crown it still effectively holds. This series is so beloved that its slimes, spells, and even musical cues are ingrained in Japanese pop culture. Case in point, at the opening ceremony of the Tokyo 2020 Olympics, guess what the very first song played was? The Dragon Quest theme, specifically Erdrick's theme, a theme from 1986 echoing in an Olympic stadium in 2021, giving the world a taste of Japan's gaming heritage. By the end of the 1980s, Dragon Quest had 3 main games out, with a 4th in development, and a legion of fans in Japan. There were manga and anime adaptations, toy merchandise, even people naming their kids after characters, or so the stories go. It's no exaggeration to say that Dragon Quest launched the console RPG genre and shaped a generation of gamers and game designers in its homeland. However, if you were a kid in North America at that time, you might have been completely oblivious to this JRPG craze going on across the Pacific. In the West, the late 80s console scene was dominated by platformers and action games. Your Marios, Zeldas, and Mega Men. The concept of a slow-paced, text-heavy role-playing game on the NES was virtually unknown. The stage was set for a grand experiment. Could this Japanese sensation find success in the West? Nintendo and Enix were about to find out, with Dragon Quest's very first installment as the guinea pig. But first, they had a problem. Even the name Dragon Quest couldn't make the journey unchanged. Before we tackle how Dragon Quest became Dragon Warrior in the US, let's step back to the development of the original game. Understanding how Dragon Quest was made will give us a greater appreciation of its design and why it stood out. Plus, the story of its development is pretty epic in its own right, involving chance encounters and creative genius coming together. As we mentioned, Yuji Horii was the mastermind driving the project. A lifelong gamer and writer, Horii had been fascinated by early computer RPGs, particularly the Western hits Wizardry and Ultima. Those games were deep and complex, but they were also seen as intimidating. They required thick manuals, had clunky text parser interfaces or first-person wireframe mazes, and ran on PCs, which relatively few people had. Horii's stroke of genius was to distill the RPG experience down to its most fun core elements and fit it on a console cartridge. He said effectively, "Let's take the excitement of exploration, monster battles, and character growth and make it simple enough that any kid could understand it on an NS." This meant streamlining things. For example, instead of controlling an entire Dungeons and Dragons-style party of characters, the player would control just one hero. That alone made the game easier to pick up. You only manage one set of stats and equipment, one character's worth of decisions in battle, etc. In Horii's own words, he wanted a new kind of RPG that did not rely on previous experience with D&D, didn't require hundreds of hours of grinding, and could appeal to any kind of gamer. Horii wasn't a programmer, so he teamed up with Koichi Nakamura, a prodigious young programmer who had won a coding contest at Enix and founded his own company, Chunsoft. Nakamura could bring Horii's ideas to life on the Famicom. Together, they started prototyping what would become Dragon Quest. Early on, they drew inspiration from an unexpected place. One of Horii's own earlier works, the Portopia mystery game, had a first-person dungeon section. Horii saw how players enjoyed exploring that dungeon and thought it would be cool to incorporate exploration in a fantasy RPG context. Meanwhile, a trip to a Macworld Expo or Applefest 83 in the US exposed Horii and Nakamura to wizardry on an Apple II, an experience that reportedly blew their minds and convinced them more than ever to make their dream RPG a reality. Now, making an RPG in 1985/1986 for the Famicom was uncharted territory. There were no templates to follow for console RPGs. Horii and his team were essentially inventing the JRPG genre as they went. They faced technical limits. The Famicom cartridge had tiny memory space, and without modern mappers, things like saving your game were not straightforward. Initially, the Japanese version of Dragon Quest didn't even have a battery to save data. It relied on password saves. Yes, if you wanted to continue your quest, you had to input a 20-character code the game gave you. Every kid's favorite activity, squinting at a mix of letters and numbers, praying you wrote them down correctly. Despite these hurdles, the team implemented the core features: a top-down world to explore, towns full of NPCs to talk to, dangerous dungeons, turn-based battles initiated by random monster encounters, and a simple leveling system that made your hero stronger and unlocked spells as you gained experience points. Let's talk about gameplay design for a second. One radical decision was to limit battles to one-on-one encounters, meaning you face one monster at a time. This was likely done to keep things simple and reduce on-screen complexity. It also lent an interesting dynamic. Every encounter is essentially a duel. You versus a slime, you versus a dragon, mano a mano, or mano a monstro. Combat was menu-driven. You could fight, run, cast a spell, or use an item, and outcomes were determined by stats and a bit of luck. This formula might sound basic now, but it set the template that JRPGs would use for years to come. In fact, if you've played any turn-based RPG, those commands should sound very familiar. Dragon Quest didn't copy D&D or Ultima wholesale. It reinvented RPG combat for console players, making it more straightforward without losing the sense of strategy and progression. And of course, the charm of the game world was hugely enhanced by Toriyama's art and Sugiyama's music. It's hard to overstate how novel this combination was. Toriyama's characters were not the burly, stereotypical Western fantasy heroes. They had a distinct anime flair. The hero of Dragon Quest, the character you play, is depicted as a young warrior in bright blue and green armor, with a flowing cape and an almost goofy-looking helmet, more endearing than intimidating. The monsters were even more unique. Cute blue slimes with big eyes, hulking orange dragons, skeleton knights, and Dracula-like wizards. Thanks to Toriyama, even the enemies had personality. Players never saw the hero on screen in battle. Battles are shown from the hero's first-person perspective, so the monsters effectively stole the show visually. And then there's Sugiyama's soundtrack, melodic, catchy, and surprisingly grand. The cartridge could only produce simple electronic tones, but Sugiyama composed the music as if he were scoring Star Wars. The result, tunes like the opening overture and the peaceful town theme that players would hum long after putting the controller down. Fun fact, Sugiyama allegedly composed the iconic Dragon Quest overture in just 5 minutes, in a taxi on the way to meet the game team, as one story goes. Yet it's a piece of music that has been performed by full orchestras worldwide for decades. With all these elements in place, Dragon Quest 1986 invited players into a world that felt alive and rich, despite the limited technology. For many Japanese gamers, this was their first taste of a narrative-driven game where you had a goal beyond just a high score or reaching the end of a stage. Instead, you had a quest. Explore, become stronger, and save the kingdom. And crucially, you could tackle it at your own pace. If a monster was too tough, you could retreat, fight weaker foes, gain levels, and come back later. This gameplay loop of leveling up through combat, sometimes dubbed grinding, and incremental progression became a cornerstone of JRPGs. It was satisfying and addictive. There was always another level to gain, another piece of gear to buy, another region of the map to brave once you were strong enough. From a development perspective, the team kept things manageable by focusing on a solo adventure, one hero, one continent to explore, and by reusing simple mechanics in clever ways. For example, there's a part of Dragon Quest where you need to rescue the princess from a dragon. After defeating the dragon, there's no automatic cutscene that whisks the princess away. Instead, your hero physically carries Princess Gwaelin in his arms. A special sprite shows the hero holding her, all the way back to the castle. The game doesn't actually change any controls. It just overlays the princess on your hero's sprite. But this little touch made players feel the weight, emotionally and gameplay-wise, of the rescue. You literally couldn't do anything else, like fight or use stairs, until you brought her home safely. It's a moment seared into many players' memories. Our first escort mission, one might joke, but also the first time an NES game tried to portray a bit of romantic chivalry. On the way back, if you talk to the princess, she asks if you love her. If you, the silent hero, say no, she famously replies, "But thou must," and asks again, one of the earliest and cheekiest examples of a game forcing you to choose the correct answer, which has since become a meme in gaming circles. Dragon Quest had these simple yet charming narrative moments that gave the adventure a soul beyond stats and combat. In summary, Dragon Quest was crafted with a clear vision: make the RPG genre accessible and fun on a console. Hori, Toriyama, and Sugiyama, now often revered as a dream team, succeeded beyond expectations. The game sold about 2 million copies worldwide in the 1980s, a huge number back then, including over 1.5 million in Japan alone. It won awards, spawned those sequels we talked about, and created the JRPG blueprint. Hori had hoped to create a game anyone could enjoy, and in Japan, that certainly seemed to be the case. Kids, teens, even adults were getting hooked on Dragon Quest. But what about that faraway land known as North America? At the time of Dragon Quest's success, the Western NES audience didn't even know they were missing out on this RPG revolution. That was about to change, albeit slowly. The epic journey of localizing Dragon Quest for the West would involve not only translation, but cultural translation as well. Get ready, because now our story shifts to how Dragon Quest left its homeland and transformed into Dragon Warrior. 3. From Dragon Quest to Dragon Warrior, bringing the quest west. Let's fast forward to 1989. Nintendo of America, flush with the success of the NES and hits like Super Mario Bros. 3 and Zelda, decided it was time North American players got a taste of this Dragon Quest thing that was all the rage in Japan. Enix, the publisher in Japan, partnered with Nintendo for the Western release because Nintendo had the marketing muscle and distribution network. However, bringing Dragon Quest overseas was not as simple as just translating the text. In fact, even the name had to be changed. Why Dragon Warrior? Well, it turned out that in the US, the name Dragon Quest was already trademarked. It was the title of a tabletop RPG by TSR, the folks behind Dungeons & Dragons. To avoid a legal tussle, the game was renamed Dragon Warrior for its North American debut. And thus, for over a decade, Western gamers knew the series by this alternate name. It wasn't until 2005, with Dragon Quest VIII, that the original title was finally used worldwide. The name change was just the beginning. The localization team set out to adapt the game for a Western audience that might not be familiar with RPGs at all. Nintendo of America made several notable changes in the process of localization, essentially tweaking the game's presentation and content to suit what they believed Western players, especially kids, would respond to. Here are the key differences: language and tone. Rather than a straight translation, the English script was rewritten in a pseudo-Elizabethan, ye olde English style. Characters say thou and thy and hast. They sound like they walked out of a Shakespeare play, or Monty Python's King Arthur skit, depending on your perspective. This choice was likely made to give the game a more medieval fantasy flavor for Western audiences. In Japan, the dialogue was just normal Japanese, with maybe a somewhat formal tone for nobles. In the US, we got lines like, "Thy deeds have earned thee a new title of Erdrick's heir." It was charming and cheesy in equal measure. For a lot of kids, Dragon Warrior was their introduction to archaic English. To this day, some of us jokingly say thou because of this game. On the flip side, Nintendo censored or toned down any content they deemed inappropriate for children. Not that Dragon Quest was particularly risque, but any mild swears or religious references were removed. For example, in Japan, you might go to a church to save your game, in later DQ titles. But Nintendo had a general no religious symbols policy in the NES era, so things like crosses on gravestones might be altered. Dragon Warrior was scrubbed squeaky clean. It was marketed as an all-ages adventure. Visual changes, from anime to Western fantasy. One of the most striking differences is the box art and promotional artwork. In Japan, Dragon Quest's box art featured Akira Toriyama's whimsical style, the hero, the princess, and the Dragon Lord in a cartoonish yet epic pose. But in North America, in 1989, anime-style art was not yet a proven sell for video games. These were the pre-Dragon Ball Z, Saturday morning days after all, when many American kids hadn't seen Toriyama's style. So, Nintendo of America commissioned a completely different cover for Dragon Warrior. Out went Toriyama's cute slime and quirky hero. In came a painting of a muscular knight facing off against a fearsome serpentine dragon, looking like the cover of a Dungeons & Dragons manual or a Western fantasy novel. The logo was bold red/orange with a claw-like font for Dragon Warrior, and the tagline on the box read, "Your mystical quest begins. Search out the dragon's lair." They were clearly aiming to attract fans of high fantasy. Fun exercise. Put the Japanese and US boxes side by side. It's hard to tell it's the same game. Inside the box, Nintendo did include Toriyama's original character art in the game manual and a separate bestiary booklet, which was a nice nod to the source material. But on store shelves, you'd only see the dramatic Western art. The Western box art for Dragon Warrior on NES went for a classic fantasy vibe, quite different from its Japanese Dragon Quest counterpart. Nintendo changed the name from Dragon Quest due to a trademark issue, and the rebranding came with this iconic cover. In-game graphics and features. Interestingly, the US version of Dragon Warrior actually made a few improvements to the original game. Remember those limitations like no battery save? Nintendo fixed that. The Western release added a battery backup to the cartridge so you could save your game easily. No need for those long passwords. This was a huge quality of life upgrade. They also took the opportunity to polish some graphics. According to accounts from that time, character sprites were tweaked to have more frames to toss directions. For example, making sure the hero's sprite had unique images for walking left, right, up, down. The original might have been more limited. They also rounded out some of the terrain tiles on the world map to make the environment look a bit nicer. None of these changes altered gameplay, but they did make the game a bit more visually appealing and user-friendly for the NES audience. In effect, Dragon Warrior, NES, became the definitive version of the game at that time, as it included some enhancements on top of the Japanese original. Nintendo even gave the game an extensive English localization, making sure item and spell names would make sense to players, though some were quirky, e.g. the healing spell was called Heal, which is clear, but the big one was Hurt More for a strong attack spell. Not exactly Tolkien-esque naming, and of course, they implemented that faux medieval speech pattern throughout, which extended to item descriptions and everything. For example, instead of saying nothing was found when you search an empty spot, the game says, there is no sign of a treasure chest here. Very polite, very medieval, and sometimes very wordy. Guides and help. Nintendo was well aware that most NES players had never touched an RPG. Dropping kids into Alfgard without guidance could have been a disaster. What do you mean I have to talk to the NPCs and not just jump on them? So, they took unprecedented steps to make sure players wouldn't feel lost. The game's packaging in North America was beefed up to include a full spiral-bound Explorer's Handbook, essentially a starter strategy guide. This booklet had not just instructions, but maps of important areas, a bestiary of enemies with their art and stats, and tips for the first hours of the game. It was basically Nintendo Power in print form, right in the box. Speaking of Nintendo Power, the magazine heavily promoted Dragon Warrior. Issues featured strategy sections, charts, and yes, comic illustrations of scenes from the game. The idea was to educate players on what an RPG is and why it's fun. This all came to a head with an infamous marketing move. In late 1990, Nintendo Power literally gave away Dragon Warrior for free to its subscribers. Yes, you heard that right, free. If you subscribed or renewed your subscription to Nintendo Power magazine, you'd get a copy of Dragon Warrior plus a strategy guide and maps delivered to your door. This is the stuff of legend. Around 500,000 copies were distributed through that promotion. Nintendo's logic was twofold. They had a lot of unsold Dragon Warrior cartridges, since initial sales in 1989 were underwhelming, and they desperately wanted to get players hooked on the RPG genre. And guess what? It worked. Almost 500,000 new players suddenly had Dragon Warrior, and many of them actually tried it out. It was essentially a Trojan horse to get JRPGs into North American homes. The promotion was so massive that Nintendo Power's hotline was inundated with players calling in confused or stuck in the game. Imagine the poor game counselors explaining how to find Erdrick's token for the 300th time. The call volume got so crazy that the hotline staff made jokey pins that said, "I survived Dragon Warrior after it was over." You can picture it. A legion of new adventurers wandering Alfgard thanks to Nintendo's giveaway. Some completely perplexed, others discovering a new favorite game. So, with all these localization efforts, Dragon Warrior on the NES made its debut in North America in August 1989. How was it received by Western gamers and press? The results were mixed at first. Many NES owners simply didn't know what to make of this slow, text-heavy game. Some found it boring or too hard, since you had to grind levels in the beginning or else even weak enemies would crush you. Remember, these were kids used to the instant gratification of stomping a Goomba in Mario. Dragon Warrior required patience and a different mindset. Sales were modest initially, hence the huge giveaway to boost interest. Reviews at the time from those who got it were actually fairly positive, praising the depth and the sense of adventure, but a lot of players ignored it in favor of flashier games. However, those who did dive into Dragon Warrior often fell in love. I'll confess a personal anecdote here. I became aware of Dragon Warrior when a friend excitedly showed me the Nintendo Power issue that had the game's coverage and maps. It looked like a whole new world to explore, literally. When I finally got my hands on it, yes, via that Nintendo Power free copy, I was initially confused why I, the hero, kept dying to slimy blue blobs. Then I learned, I need to level up and buy better gear. And those slimes that bullied me soon became minor nuisances. There was a real sense of growth and accomplishment that felt different from beating an action game, I was hooked, and I wasn't alone. Dragon Warrior became a cult favorite among a certain set of NES players. It might not have been a blockbuster on par with Zelda over here, but it planted the seeds of JRPG fandom in the West. Let's highlight a few quintessential Dragon Warrior experiences that Western players went through. The first grind. Every Dragon Warrior player remembers the early game grind. You start outside King Lorik's castle with a meager club and clothes for armor. The moment you step out, a blue slime attacks. Early battles are actually quite tense. You might only have 2 HP after killing a couple of slimes and need to crawl back to the inn already. So you circle the safe starting area, fighting slimes and red slimes until you save up enough gold for a copper sword or a leather armor. It took time, but earning that gear felt awesome. Little did we know this grind loop would become a hallmark of JRPGs. We were learning RPG progression 101. This plot point doesn't affect gameplay, but it adds a mythic weight to your adventure. For Western players, it was a cool bit of lore. Oh, I'm special because my ancestor was basically King Arthur in this world. We would later see this Erdrick name pop up again in the series, but at the time, it was just a neat storytelling element that made us feel connected to a larger history. Rescuing Princess Gwaelin. I mentioned this earlier. It's one of the most memorable quests in the game. Gwaelin, renamed Princess Gwaelin from Princess Laura in Japan, is being held captive by a green dragon in a cave not too far from the starting castle. The thing is, you don't actually need to rescue her to beat the game. It's technically an optional side quest. But who in their right mind would leave a princess in peril? For many of us, this was the first major goal after surviving the opening hours. When I finally defeated the dragon, which probably required reaching a decent level and using the sleep spell or a lot of heal more times than I'd care to admit, the sense of triumph was enormous. Carrying the princess back as the game played a sweet tune felt like the game was patting me on the back. And yes, when she asked if I would love her forever, I was a dumb kid who said no the first time, only to be met with her insisting, "But thou must," until I relented. Little did I know this would become one of gaming's famous inside jokes. That whole sequence injected a bit of fairy tale romance into an otherwise solitary adventure. Plus, Gwaelin gives you an item, Gwaelin's Love, afterwards, that helps you locate yourself relative to the final goal, an early example of a quest reward with gameplay utility. Bridging to new lands. In Dragon Warrior, the world opens up bit by bit. At first, bridges act as gateways. Crossing a bridge usually means the monsters on the other side are a lot tougher. This was the game's elegant way of guiding you without an explicit level cap. If you wander too far too soon, you'll know it when a wolf or a magician wipes the floor with you. One vivid memory is finally daring to cross that first big bridge south of Tanacle Castle and reaching the region where the town of Garinhem and the desert cave lie. The monsters got harder, but I had leveled up enough to survive. That feeling of expanding the range of your travels, it was like when you learn to ride a bike and suddenly the whole neighborhood is within reach. Each bridge crossed in Dragon Warrior felt like a significant milestone. The final battle. We can't talk about the game without mentioning the final showdown with the Dragon Lord. After assembling key items, the Sunstone, the Staff of Rain, the token proving your heritage, etc., you create a rainbow bridge to reach the Dragon Lord's castle. There, after navigating a tricky dungeon, you confront the Dragon Lord himself, in humanoid form initially. And here, Dragon Warrior threw a curveball. The Dragon Lord offers you a deal. "Half the world is yours if thou wilt join me," he says, in fancy old English, of course. The first time, many of us paused. Could this be a real choice? Join the evil guy? What happens if I say yes? Naturally, curiosity got the better of some of us. If you answer yes, the screen goes dark, and essentially, you get a non-standard game over. The game freezes, the music stops, and you have to reset. That was Dragon Warrior's way of saying, "Wrong answer, bucko. Try again and be a hero this time." It was a trick, sure, but a memorable one. Decline his offer and the Dragon Lord shows his true form, a huge, fire-breathing dragon leading to a tough final battle. Victory brings peace to Alefgard, and you, the hero, get praise, but interestingly, do not automatically take the throne. In a cute ending scene, you actually tell the king that you want to go off and found your own kingdom with Princess Gwaelin by your side. The king is shocked. Who refuses a perfectly good kingdom? But ultimately, he supports your independent streak. Off you go to new adventures. which, unbeknownst to players then, set up the storyline of Dragon Quest II, where you play as the descendants of this hero in new lands. But that's another story. All these moments made Dragon Warrior a game that stuck in our imaginations. It moved at a slower pace and required more investment than most NES titles, but the payoff was a feeling of going on a true adventure. Many of us poured dozens of hours into it, scribbling notes and maps, comparing findings with friends on the playground. By the early 90s, thanks to Dragon Warrior, other JRPGs started trickling into the Western market, like Final Fantasy on NES in 1990. Dragon Warrior might not have been a smash hit initially, but its legacy in the West was quietly profound. It proved there was a hunger, or at least a curiosity, for RPGs here, and it trained a generation in the ways of the JRPG. Nintendo's gamble to give it away paid off in the long run. Those 500,000 kids who got the freebie now knew what an RPG was, and some would go on to seek more. Personally, I went from Dragon Warrior to Final Fantasy to Dragon Warrior through it and beyond, firmly cementing RPGs as my favorite genre. Now that we've recounted how Dragon Warrior came to be and what it was like to experience it back in the day, it's time to leave the past. Put away the graph paper maps and 8-bit tunes. Well, maybe keep the tunes. How does Dragon Warrior hold up today? What is its influence on gaming after all these years? And how do we, looking back with modern eyes, view this trailblazing RPG? Let's reflect, with a mix of nostalgia and critical hindsight. Fourth, legacy of the legendary hero. Dragon Warrior. It's been well over 3 decades since Dragon Warrior first invited players to Tantegel Castle. In that time, the Dragon Quest series has grown immensely. We're talking 11 main sequels as of 2021, and dozens of spin-offs, from monster-catching games to building block sandbox games. The franchise eventually regained its Dragon Quest name worldwide, and in Japan, it remains a cultural juggernaut. But Dragon Warrior, the game, the legend, how is it remembered, and what influence did it ultimately have? The template for JRPGs? Game historians and critics often credit Dragon Quest with establishing the basic template for Japanese console RPGs. Play almost any JRPG, and you'll see the DNA it inherited from this game. A world map with towns and dungeons, turn-based battles, experience points, and leveling up. A mix of main story quests and optional side objectives, and a narrative framework of a young hero rising to beat an ultimate evil. Of course, later games refined and expanded the formula, but the core loop and feel can be traced right back to Dragon Warrior. Even Final Fantasy, which became hugely popular in the West, was originally inspired by Dragon Quest's success. Squaresoft essentially thought, we need a game like that, but our own spin, and thus Final Fantasy 1987 was born. They added party-based combat and a few other twists, but it's clearly following in DQ's footsteps. So, if you've ever enjoyed a console RPG, whether it's Pokemon, Chrono Trigger, Earthbound, or modern titles like Persona, you have Dragon Quest to thank for pioneering the genre conventions that make those games work. Influence on developers and pop culture. The generation of game developers that grew up in the late 80s and 90s were heavily influenced by Dragon Warrior. We see homages everywhere. The concept of a slime as an enemy is now ubiquitous in RPGs. It's practically a requirement to have a weak blob creature in your bestiary, but none are as iconic as the DQ slime. In Japan, the slime became an official mascot of sorts. It appears on merchandise and and there's even a line of slime-themed toys and plushies. If you ask a random person in Tokyo to draw a slime, they'll likely doodle the familiar Dragon Quest shape. The term JRPG, Japanese RPG itself, conjures an image of Dragon Quest or Final Fantasy-style gameplay, as opposed to Western RPGs like Diablo or Skyrim. And speaking of Final Fantasy, that friendly rivalry between DQ and FF has pushed both series to improve and innovate, driving the RPG genre forward worldwide. In Japan, the cultural footprint of Dragon Quest is enormous. We mentioned the school skipping incident, but also consider that new DQ releases, even today, are treated like events. People line up for midnight launches. Characters like the hero, often called Erdrick's descendant in reference to DQ1, and the Dragon Lord are referenced in other media. There was a Dragon Quest anime back in the day, and more recently, a CG movie, Dragon Quest Your Story. Even outside Japan, elements of Dragon Warrior have permeated pop culture. The classic victory fanfare, that short jingle after you win a battle, is instantly recognizable to gamers. A little triumph tune that has been remixed and reused in various forms. And one fun tidbit. In 2019, Super Smash Bros. Ultimate added the hero as a playable character, representing the Dragon Quest series. One of the hero's alternate costumes and identities in Smash is the Dragon Quest I hero. Yes, the very hero from Dragon Warrior, with its blue hair, green tunic, and copper sword. To see this character, whom we only ever knew as a nameless 8-bit sprite or a Toriyama illustration, fully realized in 3D trading blows with Mario and Pikachu, was surreal and gratifying for longtime fans. It's like Dragon Warrior finally took a bow on the global stage and everyone clapped. Modern availability and remakes. Dragon Warrior has been remade and re-released several times, which is a testament to its enduring appeal. There was a Super Famicom remake bundled with DQ2 in the 90s that updated the graphics and smoothed out gameplay. The West didn't get that version at the time, but we did get a Game Boy Color version in 2000 as Dragon Warrior Y and 2, which introduced a new generation to the game through their handhelds. That version even tweaked a few things to reduce grinding, etc. Most recently, Dragon Quest I was released on mobile phones and the Nintendo Switch, making it easy to pick up and play this classic today. Those modern releases use more updated graphics, kind of halfway between NES and SNES style, and of course maintain the quality of life improvements. The fact you can still buy and play Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest 35 plus years later, and that it's still enjoyable, says a lot. Sure, by modern standards, it's extremely simple and short. You can beat it in maybe 10 hours or less if you know what you're doing. At a casual first-time pace, maybe 15 hours. But it's like comfort food, simple ingredients, but so satisfying if you have the palate for it. Critically, when people revisit Dragon Warrior today, they often note its simplicity. And this can be either a charm or a turnoff. On one hand, yes, it's simplistic and grindy. You basically fight monsters, level up, and occasionally talk to an NPC for a hint. There are no side quests with branching narratives or complex party strategies as you'd find in later RPGs. The plot is straightforward. Some might say it's too primitive to be fun now, except as a historical curiosity. But others, myself included, find that there's a certain purity to Dragon Warrior's design. It's focused. It's you against the game's world. It doesn't hold your hand much, but it's also not overwhelmingly complicated. It's a bit like reading a classic novel. You sense its age, but you appreciate what it set in motion and might still enjoy its straightforward story. From a modern perspective, one can also appreciate how Dragon Warrior introduced design principles that remain relevant. For example, using visual cues to denote danger, and the bridge crossing signaling a new tier of difficulty in enemies. Or non-linear exploration in a limited way. You can technically go straight to certain late-game areas if you want, though you'll probably be destroyed, but the world is not strictly gated. It's also an early example of a game that encourages some amount of sequence breaking and player choice. You can rescue the princess early or late, it's up to you. You can decide to save up for that expensive full-plate armor now, or push forward with lighter gear and take the risk. And the game had an early New Game Plus of sorts. After beating it, sometimes players would impose challenges on themselves like beat it without rescuing the princess, or reach max level 30 and see what the secret ending text is. Spoiler. At max level, the king has a special message basically saying you're the strongest in the land. We should also mention how Dragon Warrior, and the Dragon Quest series in general, influenced localization practices. The choice to use archaic English became a defining trait of the series' localizations in the 1990s. By Dragon Warrior 4, the localization team went even further, giving characters distinct dialects and accents in English. This style has been polarizing. Some love the flavor it adds, others find it hammy. But it all started with the faux Shakespearean English in Dragon Warrior. In fact, phrases like "thou hast done well" or "thy deeds," etc. became closely associated with Dragon Quest in the West. The modern localizations post-2000s have toned it down a bit and only use the archaic speech for certain characters or towns. But fans have a nostalgia for the old translation because it gave the game a storybook feel. It's an interesting case study of how to handle fantasy linguistics in translation. And let's not ignore the obvious. Dragon Warrior paved the way for its sequels in the West. After the first game slowly gained a cult following, Dragon Warrior 2, 3, and 4 were localized and released on the NES in subsequent years. Each of those games improved on the formula, and for many Western RPG fans, Dragon Warrior 4, 1992 in particular, was a masterpiece of the 8-bit era, with multiple chapters, deeper story, and more complex gameplay. But without Dragon Warrior I laying the groundwork, and without that Nintendo Power giveaway hooking a critical mass of players, It's unlikely we would have gotten those sequels here at all. In fact, after DW4, the series went on a long hiatus in the West. Dragon Quest Fifth's Investing on NES never left Japan in the 90s, partly because the NES market was shifting and Enix USA closed its offices in 1995. So Dragon Warrior R4 stood as this complete saga Western fans had on NES, and then nothing new for a while, until 7 on PlayStation in 2001. Because of this, there's a strong, nostalgic attachment to the original Dragon Warrior among those who grew up with it. It wasn't just the first game, it was one of only a few Dragon Quest titles we had for a long time. In Japan, of course, the series thrived uninterrupted. But interestingly, even as the franchise evolved, it never abandoned its roots. Play Dragon Quest XI, the latest main entry as of now. And you'll find that, under the modern graphics, it's still got the heart of Dragon Warrior. Turn-based battles, exploration, leveling, saving the world as a chosen hero, slimes smiling at you before you bop them on the head. The continuity of design is remarkable. Dragon Quest games are often praised for being consistently fun and comforting in their familiarity, like visiting an old friend. That old friend is essentially the gameplay of Dragon Warrior. Other series reinvent themselves dramatically. Final Fantasy, for instance, changes its systems every game. But Dragon Quest knows what its fans want, a polished version of that original adventure feeling. So, how do we view Dragon Warrior today? With a mix of appreciation and affection. It's a game that definitely shows its age, but instead of detracting, that age gives it a charming retro quality. It's like an old classic car. Sure, it doesn't have the bells and whistles of a modern ride, but it's got character and it runs just fine if you maintain it. Modern reviewers looking back have noted its limitations. Grinding can be tedious. The story is bare bones, etc. But even so, they acknowledge how important it was. Many retrospectives call it the RPG that started it all, at least on consoles. And when ranking Dragon Quest games, even if the first one isn't at the top for everyone, it's always given respect as the granddaddy of the series. I occasionally replay Dragon Warrior on my old NES. Yes, it still works, blinking light and all. And you know what? I still get that warm feeling setting off from Tanacle Castle, with nothing but 120 gold and a key in my pocket. I still relish the moment I can afford the hand axe, or when I discover the hidden treasure in the swamp behind the fountain. Veterans know what I'm talking about. The game's design, primitive as it is, has a certain elegance and balance. By the time you've explored everything, you're usually just strong enough to win, which shows the thought put into the leveling curve. And few things are as satisfying as hearing the little tune that plays when you find an important item or open a chest with a big gold haul. It taps into that human love of reward and progress. One could say Dragon Warrior taught us some life lessons too, in its own way. It taught patience and persistence. If you don't succeed at first, fight a few more battles, gain a level, and try again. It taught problem solving. Saving up for that pricey piece of armor felt like planning a budget, and it certainly expanded our vocabulary, forsooth. Where else would a 10-year-old learn words like thy and fair one and dominion? Jokes aside, the legacy of Dragon Warrior is alive and well. Every time a new Dragon Quest comes out, I can't help but think back to the original, how far the series has come, yet how much it carries its origin in its DNA. And with each slime I defeat in a modern game, I mentally tip my hat to that very first blue slime who taught me that even the smallest foe can be fearsome when you're level 1 with 8 HP. 5. Personal reflections and final thoughts. The quest that started it all. To wrap up our epic journey, I want to share a few personal reflections and humorous tidbits that didn't quite fit in the earlier sections, but are part of why Dragon Warrior remains dear to me, and many others. Consider this a casual fireside chat after the formal sermon of history and analysis, a chance to chuckle at the quirks and celebrate the memories. One thing that always makes me grin is remembering how I tried to game the game as a kid. Dragon Warrior was probably the first RPG where I experimented with things like grinding in a particular spot for optimal gains. I discovered that the hills around a certain late-game town had metal slimes, elusive enemies that give tons of XP if you manage to kill them before they run away. I spent an absurd amount of time trying to beat these wiggly little blobs that kept fleeing. They were the original T's enemy. Hard to hit, but oh so rewarding. When I finally got a lucky critical hit and defeated one, it was like winning the lottery. Dragon Warrior inadvertently taught me about probability and risk-reward. Who says games aren't educational? Then there's the memory of using the infamous stairs command. Yes, In the original game, you had to open the menu and select stairs to go up or down staircases. Simply walking on them didn't do anything. I recall countless times forgetting to do that and wondering why I wasn't going down to the next dungeon floor. It seems silly now, but at the time, this was just how games worked. We accepted it. It's one of those antiquated design things that modern ports have fixed. They auto-trigger stairs. But part of me finds the clunkiness endearing. It's a reminder of how far interface design has come. Humor in translation. While Dragon Warrior's Yay Old English is often played straight, there were a few lines that made me laugh. For example, some NPCs in the game speak with such overwrought politeness or metaphor that it's comical. One guard famously says, "Thy journey must have been long. Thou must be tired. Please rest here a while," which is a nice way of saying heal up at the inn. But as a kid, I was like, just tell me you're an inn, dude. In another town, a soldier remarks, "I have heard of thee. Thou hast gathered the relics of legend." It made me feel famous for a second, like word of my deeds had spread, but also gave me a chuckle because I imagined my hero going, "Yeah, that's me, legendary relic hoarder, how you doing?" The game's earnestness is charming and occasionally meme-worthy. Even the final boss's line, "Thou art a fool," if you refuse his offer, became something my friends and I would dramatically say to each other on the playground. The grind that binds. Perhaps weirdly, some of my fondest memories are just grinding out levels while daydreaming. Dragon Warrior had a pretty cool feature. You could hold down the A button to make text scroll faster in battle, effectively auto-choosing fight each round. So once you were strong enough in an area, you could tape down the A button and let your hero kind of farm monsters on autopilot. Note, do this near a town so you don't die unexpectedly. I do this while doing homework or something else, periodically checking if I needed to heal at the inn. It was the ancestor of today's idle games, I suppose. There was something almost meditative about it. And when you finally saw that, "Thou art now level 18 and thy power increases by 7. Message pop up, you'd fist pump quietly. This background grinding habit started with Dragon Warrior and continued in other RPGs I played. It taught me patience and multitasking. I'm generously going to call it that, not laziness. On a more heartfelt note, Dragon Warrior was a game that brought people together in my circle. I have vivid memories of sitting on the floor with my older brother, mapping out the final dungeon on graph paper. He controlled the hero while I drew the map and noted where traps or chests were. It felt like we were exploring together. When we finally found the Dragon Lord's lair, it was a triumphant high-five moment. Similarly, that Nintendo Power subscription deal meant a bunch of kids in my neighborhood got the game around the same time, and suddenly we were all comparing notes. If someone found something cool, word spread via school lunch table chatter. Essentially, we had our own little community guide. One friend discovered that if you searched in a certain spot in one town, you'd find a hidden item, Erdrick's token in the swamp behind Hawksness, for those in the know. Revealing that tidbit made him the hero of the week among us, as we all went home to try it. In an era before widespread internet, this kind of peer-to-peer hint sharing was precious. Dragon Warrior thus has this warm association in my mind of cooperative problem solving and shared excitement. And how can I forget the first time I beat the game? It was late at night, past my bedtime, don't tell my parents. My hero was in his early 20s level-wise, decked out in Erdrick's equipment. I remember my heart pounding as I went through my last big fight with the Dragon Lord. It was a battle of attrition, trading blows and using heal more when my HP got low. I was running out of magic points. It was down to the wire. Finally, the Dragon Lord fell and that victory music played. I think I actually whooped out loud, probably waking someone up. Then the ending sequence rolled, with its surprisingly sweet music and ending text, and I felt content. It wasn't just the satisfaction of beating a game, it felt like I had lived through an adventure and come out the other side. It's a feeling I'd later get from beating other RPGs with great stories. But Dragon Warrior was the first to give me that sense of a journey completed. It's the reason I fell in love with RPGs. The sense that games could be more than tests of reflex. They could be experiences with emotional highs and lows. All these experiences and feelings are why Dragon Warrior remains special. It's not just about the game's raw content, but about the era and context in which I played it. The late 80s, early 90s were a magical time for console gaming. Every new type of game was a revelation, and Dragon Warrior was one of those big revelations. As a final thought, it's interesting to consider the perspective of someone coming to Dragon Warrior fresh today. Without the nostalgia, does it still hold up as an engaging, witty adventure? I'd argue yes, if you go in with the right mindset. The game doesn't crack jokes like a modern RPG might, it's earnest to a fault. But there's a certain tongue-in-cheek humor you can derive from its old-school quirks. And engaging? Absolutely, if you appreciate a slower burn. In fact, there's been a bit of a renaissance of retro-style RPGs, and people often cite Dragon Quest as a comfort game they return to. There's a reason the franchise still uses a lot of the same sound effects and musical cues. They evoke a feeling that fans love. It's the feeling of adventure. And Dragon Warrior distilled adventure to its core components in a way that still works. So here we are, at the end of our long journey. If this were the game, we'd be hearing the finale music, and King Lorik would be congratulating us. We've looked at how Dragon Quest was born, how Dragon Warrior was made and localized, how it was received, and how it influenced gaming. We shared some laughs about medieval lingo and grinding, and some heartfelt memories of triumph and exploration. If you've stuck with me this far, chances are you either share some of this nostalgia or you're at least intrigued by this classic game story. Why does Dragon Warrior and Dragon Quest as a whole endure? I think it's because it strikes a timeless chord. The hero's journey, rendered in simple pixels and text, still captures our imagination. There's an innocence and purity to it. As games become ever more complex and sprawling, it's nice to go back to the roots once in a while and see how it all began. And it began with a hero, a dragon, and a quest. Or should I say, a warrior, a dragon lord, and a quest that crossed the seas to become a part of our gaming heritage. Thank you for joining me on this nostalgic adventure. Whether you knew it as Dragon Warrior or Dragon Quest, this little 8-bit RPG has earned its place in history with a legacy far larger than its humble file size. If you've never played it, give it a try. You might be surprised how engaging it can be. And if you have played it, maybe this video brought back a few fond memories of your own. In the words of the King of Tantegel, "Thou hast done well in reaching the end of this story. Until next time, fellow adventurers, take care, and may the light shine upon thee in thy quests ahead."